we found that there are kind of 4 or 5 major takeaways. The first one was a benchmarking gap between high and medium impact programs has grown to nearly 2 times, which means that high impact programs, those programs that employ ethical decision making, organizational justice, and freedom of expression, are twice as likely to use benchmarking data, reporting data, and leveraging advanced tools including data analytics and automation to manage their compliance programs. Not only that, those high impact programs are 1.5 times more likely to report that benchmarking data to their board of directors and the senior management teams.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our interview with Ty Francis. Ty is Chief Advisory Officer at LRN Corporation, and he has been in trenches in this compliance and ethics business for many years. Ty, welcome to our Risk Management Show podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. My pleasure. So I believe that we will have a very thoughtful conversation on the topic of your recently published annual Ethics and Compliance Program Effectiveness Report, which provided deep dive into ethics and compliance trends across organizations worldwide. But before that, Ty, could you tell us a short story about yourself, your career path, what brought you to where you are right now, and what you guys at LRN Corporation are up to these days?
Yeah, so I've been in the compliance and ethics and compliance information space for about 20 years. I've been at LRN for 5.5 years, so I'm the Chief Advisory Officer. LRN is the largest pure play ethics and compliance company in the world right now. And we provide a lot of training and education to millions and millions of employees around the world over a number of different topics like anti-corruption, anti-bribery, anti-harassment, conflicts of interest, across a platform called Catalyst, which is a great data analytics benchmarking platform which combines information from ethics and culture surveys we do, a smart code, which is an interactive code technology, and also the training and completion data with all sorts of metrics. We've been in the space for about 30 years, LRN, and we are on pretty much every continent. We've got about 700 employees around the world. Me personally, before I joined LRN, I was at Ethisphere. I was an executive vice president there. And before that, I headed up the New York Stock Exchange's Governance Services Division, where I focused mainly on the corporate board member business. So it's been a pretty long career in ethics compliance. It's something I'm very passionate about.
Right, fantastic. So, Ty, could you elaborate on the key findings of your last ethics and compliance program effectiveness report, particularly focusing on actionable data that can help our members' organizations bridge workplace gaps?
Sure, yeah. So we provide a lot of research and reports from LRN. We have now 4 major reports. The Program Effectiveness Report is our largest report we do, and we are now in our 11th year. The report has gone through some different changes and more kind of dynamically last year. Was a big important step in how we are kind of articulating this information. We included 1,500 ethics compliance professionals around the world, and we also included the information and the perceptions from 1,500 employees as well. So what we found, we had this juxtaposition of an employee perception on how they think their compliance program is working, and the compliance professionals themselves. And that data comes from North America, Asia, and Europe as well. So it's a pretty broad data set from regions all around the world. What we did is we look at compliance programs in 3 different boxes. We look at programs we deem as high impact, medium impact, and low impact. And how we kind of figure this out is we look at programs that use ethical decision making. So that's where choices employees make are kind of animated by rules, not expediency. We look at organizational justice. So we are asking if senior executives are high performers, are held to the same standards, and conduct as other employees. So, for example, is a senior sales executive who's a rock star held to the same standards as a factory floor worker if they were to do something wrong. And then we look at freedom of expression. Are employees empowered to speak up? Are they encouraged to contribute willingly and exchange ideas freely? And then over a bunch of questions we ask, we categorize those as high, medium, and low impact programs. And then what we do then, we take that information and we look at the answers, and then we look at how these programs are affected by organizations that have this kind of structure. So to give you some takeaways that we learned from this data, and also this is based on a lot of research we've done in other parts of the industry, we found that there are kind of 4 or 5 major takeaways. The first one was a benchmarking gap between high and medium impact programs has grown to nearly 2 times, which means that high impact programs, those programs that employ ethical decision making, organizational justice, and freedom of expression, are twice as likely to use benchmarking data, reporting data, and leveraging advanced tools, including data analytics and automation, to manage their compliance programs. Not only that, those high impact programs are 1.5 times more likely to report that benchmarking data to their board of directors and the senior management teams. We also saw what we call a perception gap, and that was really focused on middle management. And this has been a trend of ours over the last few years, focusing not so much on the tone from the top, but the tone from the middle, where we feel that a lot of the compliance and culture is cascaded throughout an organization. And what we found is the gap between what the perceived perceptions of leadership and middle management making kind of difficult decisions when asked about company values was about 2 times, where we saw that senior leadership, 79% of those senior leaders were using their code of conduct, and they're using their company's values to make those difficult decisions, compared to about 39% of middle management. And that's a 42% gap, and it's the largest gap we've seen over the last 5 years when we've been running this data. And that really shows an issue that companies have with cascading that messaging down from senior leadership all the way down to the bottom of the organization. It's getting caught in the middle. And that's what we call this report, Caught in the Middle, because we feel that companies need to pay more attention and focus more on how middle management are activating and catalyzing training and education in compliance. We also saw that there was a big gap with the use of misconduct data. So this was great of high impact programs who reported 63% of these programs use misconduct data and trend analysis to help better kind of make their programs more robust, versus those medium impact programs, which came in about 33%. So the high medium multiplier for this analysis was about 1.9 times. An interesting part of this report, which I think really garnered a lot of media attention and a lot of the questions I get asked, was the emerging generational divide. So when we looked at this data, we split this up as well. We dug deeper into the data, and we looked at how compliance programs are being perceived by the boomer generation, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z. And we found that there was a kind of, again, a 2 times gap between how Gen Z employees report skepticism regarding management and the fairness in which managers kind of articulate their values. We also found in a prior report, and it's replicated here, that Gen Z, again, this is from the data collected from this survey, were twice as likely to not report misconduct and or break a rule or a principle in their code of conduct versus Gen X or boomer generation, which is quite shocking, considering that Gen Z will become probably the largest kind of cohort of employees and companies in the next 5 to 10 years. We also looked at the increased focus on emerging risks, such as things like third-party due diligence, supply chain compliance, where medium impact programs lagged again behind high impact programs, even with a greater amount at 2.3 times. Again, which was surprising considering all of the legislation that's come out of the EU, not being, just including the CSDDD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Act directive, looking at the kind of guidance that came out of the Department of Justice's memo update in September last year, when the DOJ was asking companies to be more focused on reviewing the due diligence of their third parties and suppliers. So we found that quite shocking that there's this big gap, but it all pertains to the use of data analytics, that these high impact programs are more capable of using data and using that data to create more robust programs, which is easier for them to both predict risk, allocate resources, and understand where issues in their companies are arising. And it created this area of where companies without using a lot of data are becoming very siloed. They're not being able to make decisions very quickly, and they're not being very efficient at allocating resources. So when compliance officers are complaining about not enough resources to spend on training, education, or disclosure tools, what's really happening is they're spending a lot of money in a lot of places. And without that true in-time data, they're not able to kind of focus areas and really use that time, that money and resource more effectively.
No, this is quite of a very, very interesting summary of major findings in one 5 minutes discussion. Perhaps let's dive in a specific topic, maybe regarding the corporate power struggle or widening generation gap. How is upper management currently viewed in most corporate workspaces, and what steps can leadership take to improve these perceptions?
Well, look, I think it's all about education, to be honest. I think senior leaders have been very good at articulating what their values are and what their culture is. You see a lot of codes of conduct, a lot of annual reports focusing on the CEO messaging and the board messaging. And they're very good at doing that. You see them in interviews and on town halls and, big annual meetings. But what they're not doing very well is articulating that messaging all the way down through the organization. And they're not really taking advantage of those middle managers. So what we are suggesting and what we're recommending is creating more enhanced training. So investing in like data literacy programs. So really you're empowering those like middle managers to understand how to use this data more effectively in their teams, to make them more impactful, and using some technology to make their jobs easier. And that technology isn't, expensive anymore. It's very affordable, especially if you're using benchmarking tools and dashboards to link all that data together. And they really are tailored to these medium-sized organizations. And it kind of encourages this democracy of access, so everyone can access, not just senior compliance officers. Managers should be able to access some of this data. And then also, encouraging knowledge sharing between those, senior leadership teams and management, and encouraging some of these younger generations to be part of this decision-making process. The biggest issue we see of Gen Z not really applying the rules to what they do is because they don't believe the rules were built or designed for them, because they didn't have any kind of influence in designing those rules in the first place. So what we're asking companies is to invest more time and energy, not so much money, but training middle managers, asking them to understand who they're employing and how they can help take that messaging of culture and values into the organization. We say that rules are great, but we really do believe that values are better.
Mm. So you emphasize sort of a moral compass of business. Can you give examples of how companies can lead with integrity and explain why this approach is crucial in today's environment?
Well, I think, a lot of organizations, especially the lower ranks of an organization, there's an accountability gap that they see. So they think there's some perceived favoritism or, kind of uneven disciplinary measures where high performing people aren't held to the same standards. They're not seeing transparency in decisions. So, when you look at compliance violations or misconduct, the general public or the general employee base aren't seeing what's happening. So if they're making a complaint or they're, issuing a report, they're not seeing how that report pans out. They're not seeing the results of what they're doing. And they're probably not seeing management kind of echo some of the values of senior leadership. And, like I said before, there's often limited involvement of those frontline employees. So management aren't taking, better use of feedback loops to really evaluate how their messaging is kind of resonating with the audience they're doing. So it's all about unfairness or favoritism and transparency. If employees are seeing the work in progress and they're seeing some kind of context in why these decisions are being made, or seeing that if people are violating their rules or code of conduct, that action's being taken, they're more likely to follow those rules and kind of be more involved in the values of the organization. So it's really getting that leader frontline engagement together, making sure that communication that's coming from leadership is really cascading through middle management and into the frontline employee world, and really focusing on that training development. When companies are putting training campaigns into organizations, it shouldn't be one size fits all. The training a frontline factory worker gets should be different to the training a manager gets who's employing, or supervising 200, 300, 400 people. Managers should be trained in anti-harassment, because really, if an employee comes to a manager and has a complaint or has an issue, that manager should have some idea of how to deal with that issue. And if they can't, that employee doesn't see any movement, and that employee feels trapped, siloed. And that's what kind of damages and dampens the culture in an organization. So making sure that the training is fit for purpose. So, a manager is getting different training than the frontline employee. An engineer is getting different training than a marketing assistant. Not everyone needs to know about anti-corruption or, conflicts of interest, but everyone needs to know about anti-harassment, and also how to speak up, where to speak up, and what happens if you do speak up. So making sure organizations are really focused on ensuring that employees feel safe and they feel empowered to say something without fear of retaliation.
Fantastic. So, I would like to ask you a personal point of view. What are the major misconceptions in the field of ethics and compliance that you kind of strongly disagree with?
So, well, look, I think what's happening in the industry is there's becoming it's like a reset back to what we call the checkbox compliance culture, where companies are just ticking boxes without really understanding if their compliance programs are working. Companies are still relying on completion data. So what they're assuming is if 100% of their organization has done all the training and ticked that box, they're compliant, when in fact they're not really looking at how that information is being kind of taken in by the employees. If you have training which has a multiple choice question at the end with 3 answers, and everyone answers those questions, and at the end they say 100%, great. But what we don't know is how many times did they take to answer that question? If half of your company took 3 times to answer those questions, it doesn't demonstrate they understood the training. It just demonstrates that they took 3 times to do it. And it was a process of elimination. So you've got half of your employee base that doesn't understand the training they've been given. I think training becomes too complicated. Compliance professionals need to understand that training isn't designed for them. It's designed for an employee. We're not trying to teach our employees to be compliance officers. That's our job. We're trying to help them do their jobs more effectively and understand the perils and risks of their roles, and make sure they understand what happens if they run foul of some of those rules, regulations, policies, or procedures. A very good friend of mine, Adam Balfour, gives this example of air safety guides, where you're on a plane and the cabin crew ask you to do the air safety training, and they go to the captain and say, everyone's completed the training, when you and I know that maybe 90% of all the people who were in that plane were on their phones or reading a book or having a chat or listening to music. They weren't really focused on that training. But as far as the captain's concerned, 100% of those people have done the training. So I think we need to move away from that very basic 100% completion is all we need, and start to dig deeper into, are people really understanding what we're talking to them about?
Wow, interesting. So, looking ahead, what are some emerging trends in ethics and compliance that organizations should be preparing for, and how can they ensure long-term resilience in their ethical practices?
I think companies should be reviewing the efficacy of their programs as quickly as they can. We need to be understanding that, risks change, employee kind of base change, and also that the way that we're delivering training changes as well. So, as I said, as Gen Z become a larger part of the organization, they're going to be trained differently than maybe, Gen X or baby boomers as they exit organizations. Risks change. Companies need to be, very focused on AI, not just what it is, what it does, but how it affects employees and the community at large. Supply chain issues across the world have been impacted by, global war, but also we need to understand who those people we're doing business with are. We spend a lot of time and effort measuring marketing clicks and website clicks, but we need to be more focused now on who we're doing business with, our third parties. So reviewing those contracts, reviewing the due diligence, and even going that one step further and helping train our suppliers so they understand the values and the rules and principles that our organizations have. So I think this reviewing and risk assessing constantly is going to help companies become much more resilient.
All right. So, if we summarize our interview for someone who is listening to this interview, would like to walk away with one or two major takeaways, what would that be?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
If someone who is listening to this interview would like to walk away with one or two major takeaways, what would that be?
Invest in some data analytics tools. I would say, go back to your organization and find out what data you're currently reviewing and how you're putting that back into your program. I'd also ask them to make sure that how they're looking at their middle management structure, how are they educating those middle managers? Have they empowered their managers to really take the messaging that the leadership are giving and put that into their frontline workers? So, this accountability, this psychological safety issue we're talking about, culture is not created by employees, it's created by leadership. And making sure that people really believe in the messaging that both leadership and middle management are putting into the organizations.
All right, fantastic. That's were all my questions, Ty. And perhaps if I forgot to ask you something that you feel is important to our audience, please go ahead.
No, I think, look, I think all compliance officers right now are have the same issues. We're all kind of um, held by resources and money. I just think if we're using more data analytics as a tool, we can better resource allocate. Okay, so we can take the resources we have and allocate them more efficiently just by using those data analytics tools. And they're available, they're out there. Just making sure everything's kind of tied in together. So forgetting that silo effect.
Fantastic. Thank you again for this interview, and I wish you and your company, LRN Corporation, great success. And I hope to interview you guys in the future. Perhaps we can collaborate with Global Risk Community on content sharing and stuff like this. Thank you
Well,
again.
thank you so much, Boris. It's been a pleasure to be with you today.
Absolutely. Thanks.